Okay, good morning. And with that, I am going to turn this over to our presenters.
Good morning, everybody. I'm just waiting for Nina to put the slides on presentation view. And while she's doing that, I'll just introduce myself.
Working on it.
Okay, great. My name is Emily Melnick, and I'm an independent evaluation consultant. I work with a couple of different youth prevention coalitions in Connecticut, and then with a wide range of other types of clients around the state. And I will turn it over to Mark to introduce himself while Nina is, oh, there we go. So Mark, do you want to introduce yourself and then Nina? You're muted, Mark.
Oh, I'll jump in. Nina Chanana, I am also an independent consultant. I work in the state, typically around planning, assessment, and evaluation. I'm really glad to be here today, and hopefully you guys will get some great information from our presentation.
Okay, now that with my mute off, I'll try it again. Good afternoon. I'm Mark Goldstein. I'm a retired professor of community psychology from Central Connecticut State University. During my time at CCSU, I did consulting work in program evaluation and related areas through their Center for Social Research and Public Policy. My work was principally with community drug prevention coalitions as well as some nonprofit organizations. Since leaving CCSU, I have continued to do consulting work with coalitions as an independent consultant. Okay.
Okay.
All right, so a little technical difficulty. Give me 1 second.
Okay, so while Nina's doing that, we don't need to look at the ground rule slides. Jen went over a lot of those anyway. I just wanted to emphasize that we know that there's a lot of people on the call who have a wide range of experience and examples from their own work about the information issues that we'll be talking about. And we really encourage you all to either use the chat function during our presentation or after we're finished, and we will do our best to answer any questions and make sure you're heard as well. And just also offering, the three of us are offering that after the session, if there are anything that comes up in any way that we can be of help in this arena, please reach out to us, and you will have, as Jen said, the slide deck, which has all of our emails on it. Most of you have your cameras on. We appreciate that. Again, as Jen said, we're recording it. She will make sure that the slides are shared. And again, we look forward to hearing from you and learning from you as well as we proceed. Okay, so getting into why we're all here today, our goal today is to provide an overview on equity, specifically around youth survey and school-based survey data collection, although other examples will be discussed, and we are happy to discuss other arenas in which there's interest and expertise. Why is this important? Why is this important? We hope that, this, by talking to you about data collection in this realm, that you will improve your ability or continue your ability to achieve equity-based data collection, which will help you know more about the populations that you serve and the differences in terms of the approaches that you may seek to implement to best serve folks in the community. The next slide. We will provide rationale for collecting and analyzing data by a variety of different subpopulations. Again, we're going to be focusing on the work that the three of us do around collecting adolescent survey data, focusing on both substance use and mental health issues. We'll talk more specifically about strategies to identify and disaggregate data when issues come up in your community, and how, once we have that information, we can work most effectively to both inform key stakeholders and decision makers, but also most importantly to address strategies that address the needs that we've identified. We'll also talk just to mention the use of disparity impact statement, which for those of you that have SAMHSA grants, that is a required element of SAMHSA grantees to ensure that your work is inclusive of underserved racial and ethnic community members in your community. And again, by all means, we know a lot of you on the call, and for those of you that we don't, we look forward to learning from you as we discuss what we know is a very relevant and timely issue for all of you. We're going to start out, since we know some of you, but not all of you, and you don't all know each other, to just get a sense of kind of who's in the virtual room. The first poll, which Jen will put up, just asks you which of the following types of surveys you've conducted, designed, analyzed, or been part of, thinking about the population. So youth, community or parents, program-based surveys, other surveys, or perhaps you don't do this kind of work at all. So I will give you a few seconds to do that.
Okay.
And I think Jen in real time will give us the answer.
Still seeing some few answers coming in. Looks like everyone's just about complete. Can you all see the results?
Okay, so 88% of you have designed and worked on youth studies, 75% community parent, 38% program. For those, does anyone who's done other types of surveys, want to kind of let us know what those are? And we'll ask you if you feel like it to talk about those types of surveys, and perhaps draw on all of our knowledge moving forward. No, okay. So the next poll is, to what extent do you currently consider equity when you're conducting, designing, analyzing youth surveys? Not at all, some, a lot, or that's not applicable to the work that you do.
Okay, looks like everyone's answered, and I will launch the results.
Okay, so everybody does it either some or a lot, which makes sense why you've chosen to do it. But we will kind of, and of course, some and a lot, it doesn't necessarily say every time. So we will talk about why, we'll talk about some tips and techniques to enhance equity-based data collection. But first, again, I'm going to ask, does anyone want to give us an example of any equity considerations in school or community-based surveying that you've had recently, or think would be an area that you'd want us to discuss? Oh, and then also in the chat, should I read the chat, or does that make sense? So Karen says, we've done surveys specific to certain programs. Some are Youth Leadership Academy, Youth Leadership Summits, etc. Does anyone want to speak to an equity consideration in a school or community-based survey?
Emily shared that school-based surveys miss chronically absent students.
Right, that's a good point. So if those students have certain needs that aren't being addressed because we're not surveying them, that will make us think about sampling in our sampling frame, which we will be talking about soon. So moving forward, does anyone else have any other kind of equity considerations they want to talk about? And we're going to talk about whether or not people include all the needed questions that they need to comprehensively identify and represent your population. So for Emily's example, that might be surveying over several days to make sure that kids who might have been absent on the one day that you did your survey are there on another day, talking to the school, making sure that there aren't certain days of the week, like Fridays, where kids might miss school more than other days. Nina has an example in Greenwich, I think you were going to share now.
I'm going to hold off.
Okay, all right. She'll share that with you shortly. But in the second half of this workshop, we're going to be looking more at some specific populations, why it's important. We'll be talking a lot about issues around gender identification, so that if you don't offer, for example, a non-binary or other topic, and you just ask if you identify as a male or female or boy or girl, who you might be missing and what the implications of that might be. Okay, moving forward. So we're going to ask you guys another survey. And this is, which of the following statements best describes the sampling frame of your most recent school survey? And a sampling frame is a list or a grouping of things that you draw the sample from. So it could be everybody at the school. It could be all students in a certain grade. It could be all students in a certain health class. All students, it could be all students in classes where teachers agreed to let us use the class time. There's lots of different things. So Jen's going to put that poll up and you can check more than one here. Oh, no, there's a single choice. I'm sorry. So this would be the most recent use survey.
Still coming in. I'll share them when I see it slow down here.
Mhm.
Okay.
Okay, so here are the results. So everyone at school on the day or days of the survey is the most popular, then all students in certain grades. And then the third is we asked students in classes where teachers agreed, and then either not applicable or we chose a sample of academic classes. Does anyone want to talk about any pros and cons of the sampling frame that they chose?
Or people can put stuff in the chat.
Okay, well, I'm going to turn it over to Nina. Well, we'll be talking about the sampling frame here. So, our suggestion is to use the whole school or the school district if possible. Doing it on multiple days might also be a great idea. Consider alternative schools. Some school districts have alternative high schools. I think most do, and or private schools, and you can get a better sense of what's happening. Again, if sampling is the only option where you're not going to be looking at the universal population, make sure that the classes are not constituted by ability or leveling. That's why we often like health classes or gym classes where everyone has to take it. And then also just make sure that you think about, if possible, a representative or statistically valid sample size if you're not, again, able to survey the entire population. And I am going to turn it over to Nina.
So one other area that we need to consider when we sample youth is parent consent. It's really important to always get parent consent when you're surveying youth on any topics. Typically, there are two versions of this. The most common is passive consent, which some of you are probably very familiar with. Parents are notified in advance of the survey. They're usually given 2 weeks to complete an opt-out form that they need to send back if they don't want their child participating. This is definitely the more simple method. And if you can use passive consent, you'll definitely want to. Active consent is parents also being notified ahead of time and sending back a form that says their child can participate. I only work with one community right now that is required by their Board of Education to use active consent, and it has been very, very challenging we have actually not been able to get a large enough sample from the high school students to fulfill our funding requirements. We were able to do it in the middle school, but we've worked very hard with the Board of Education, and they recently agreed to include a copy of the survey and an active consent form. They will send it out to all the parents in the school district in high school and middle school. And it will allow them to use a system to track parents that have agreed to consent. And that way we have a list where all of the students will then be able to be sent a link. So we're hoping that this works, but it's been tough. It's been difficult. So really, I'm definitely thinking this is going to be more common as we move forward with the challenges we're seeing with some Board of Educations in the state. So just be aware that we are, there are some communities that are troubleshooting this, and we can kind of work together to figure out the best approach with this active consent. Survey medium and method. So really simple. Are you doing a computer-based survey or a paper survey? Most people are now computer-based, which can be easier and less expensive. You do have to make sure you have the right program to collect the surveys. So there is a cost associated with that. One issue when we first switched to computer-based surveys was the concern about the loss of anonymity with the tracking of IP addresses. I will say SurveyMonkey does have a feature that you can turn on anonymous reporting. It's very simple to do. And what that means is when you download your file, you do not get the IP addresses included in that. So that's something that I think has really benefited us working with computer-based surveys. And one recommendation is to always have the school test any link that you might be using, just to make sure there's nothing with a firewall or something that might be, make it challenging for the survey to be done. There are some definite upsides to paper-based surveys. I would recommend making sure for the cost that you budget for the data entry, because that can be kind of something that you might not think about, and that can add up. But for some districts, I know there's one on this Zoom today, they still do paper-based surveys, and it's worked really well for them. Their school board feels more comfortable with a paper-based survey, and so we've been able to continue to do those. But pros and cons to both, but definitely things to think about when you're doing these surveys. Video introduction. So many years ago, I worked with a community that was getting feedback from the students that they had been given instructions about this survey, and it really varied from almost no instruction from their class or teacher, just saying, oh, here's a survey, take it, to teachers reading the instructions that had been given to them, and really emphasizing the importance of taking this survey and taking it seriously, and that it was confidential and that the responses would not be shared. And we felt that we needed to figure out a way to avoid this happening. So we developed a survey, an introduction to the survey in video format that everybody could then just show prior to the survey. So it took the burden off the teachers or the school staff, and it provided us a way to give uniform instruction. So I think that somebody here today I saw is very familiar with this video that I'm going to share, because it was her community that did it. I'm not going to show you the whole thing, but here's an example of one.
Hello, my name is Madison Rotella, and I just graduated from Wolcott High School, and I am a proud member of CASA, Building a Healthy Wolcott Coalition. CASA is an organization made up of community volunteers who are passionate about reducing substance abuse and promoting wellness in Wolcott, especially through collaboration, education, awareness, and community action. How I became involved with CASA is through my capstone project, which was creating the Zen Den. The Zen Den is still available and can be accessed through your school counselor. So if you're feeling stressed or anxious and need a 5 to 10 minute break, go check out the Zen Den. I promise it's great. In addition to providing prevention services, CASA also supports the middle and high school student surveys administered every 2 years on substance abuse and other risky behaviors. This survey is completely anonymous and helps advise CASA and the community on how to better support and provide resources to all of you. Please be honest and open in your responses. CASA uses this data to increase wellness efforts. For example, CASA can reduce stress and anxiety through meditation, yoga, and the Zen Den.
So that's just one example. I do have others. We definitely recommend trying to use a young adult or a recent grad to do this. So it's that peer-to-peer messaging, which can be really powerful. But we have gotten great feedback in all of the communities where we've done these videos. So another recommendation from us to you around this. So one more poll, I think this might be the last one, or maybe there's one other, but we're just curious in terms of people who are doing student surveys, if you're using an outside organization such as Search Institute or Pride or Youth Voices Count, or if you're collecting your own survey that you've designed or that's been around for years that you just inherited with your role, or maybe this isn't applicable. All right, so about half and half, which is great. You know, there is no right or wrong answer to this. And I'm going to just share some pros and cons with both using your own survey or using an outside agency. If you are using your own survey or you want to design your own survey, some of the pros, you really have some flexibility that you might not get using an outside provider. If there are some emerging trends, or you want to update some of the topics, maybe you never had a section on bullying, or you never had a section on gaming or gambling. You know, these are, you know, areas that we're more and more interested in the prevention field. So it gives you that flexibility to add those sections. And sometimes it's a less expensive way to go. Really, that depends on your approach. And then with translations, there are some limitations using an outside survey provider. Some do have Spanish translations available, but if it's other than Spanish, you're probably not going to find it. I work with a community with a very large Portuguese speaking population, so it's really important to us to have a survey that we can provide in Portuguese. And then another community where I work, they have a large Creole speaking population. So something to think about there. Some of the cons, you know, do you have somebody who can help you with the analysis and the summary and the reporting? Do you have that person or that expertise yourself? And then are you going to be able to compare your data to other communities if that's something that's important to you? Meaning your, you know, other communities you really need to make sure they're framing the questions in the same way that you are if you want to compare them. One issue is the survey will probably need to be approved through the funder if that's an issue, or through your school board. And you want to make sure that you are going to get that approval if it's your own survey. Some people have been up since 1 a.m. last night with that issue because it was their own survey. And then, you know, do you have the resources you need to get it translated, tested, getting the reporting done? So that's something to think about. And then using an outside agency, some of the pros are they're going to clean the data, they're going to do your analysis, they're going to generate a report. They are going to make sure that the data, the formatting of the questions is tested and valid. And they may have translations for you, which I think right now is only Spanish for some of them, but that might be enough. It is sometimes more expensive to use an outside agency. Will they let you request additional analysis outside of the report that they give you? Sometimes things come up and you think about some additional analysis you want for a grant application or something that's happened in the community that you hadn't originally thought about. And some of the agencies are more flexible around this than others, so it's worth asking that question. Are you given the actual data file? So for example, Search Institute will give you the raw data file for $500. And that can be nice to have. You basically now own the data. You might have somebody who can use that data. It's typically in an Excel file, so you can do additional analysis if that's something you're interested in. And then finally, are they going to allow you to add supplemental questions if that's something you need with the work you're doing? So just a quick overview of considerations, thinking about how long it takes to get the data back if you're using an outside agency, or if you're doing your own and you need somebody who's going to be preparing the summary for you. You know, do you have the right person in available to you, an evaluator or somebody who would be comfortable doing that type of work? You want to make sure when you're looking at some of the outside providers that you ask the questions about the raw data file, the pricing, what you're exactly getting with the, the cost. And are you going to have any issues with buy-in from either the school district or your funder? So thinking about all of those. We are going to talk a little bit more about that buy-in in a minute. So we'll pause right there on that. And I think, Emily, you are up.
Yes, I'm going to take over for a few minutes. So we're going to talk specifically about some language considerations that we've thought about a lot. And again, this is something where even if you want to be consistent over time, you might need to think about language, how folks, for example, are considering their ethnicity. The term Latinx is a term that some school districts are using and some folks are using. We always want to, make sure that we're considering the most current demographic terms, whether that's ethnicity, whether that's gender, as I mentioned. It's, we recommend definitely talking to community members if you don't have folks on your coalition or that you work with, to find out. There won't always be consistent. There won't always be consensus, but there's a lot of information out there about a variety of different terms that people want to be categorized as or not. Again, we want you to think about the language of the vocabulary, the receptive language that you're using. Are the youth at, kind of the range of reading levels going to understand the vocabulary and the questions? We always recommend, if you're going to be going with a survey that you develop, to pre-test that with youth. And again, as Nina was mentioning, make sure that you have, if possible, translated surveys are the best. Sometimes you might have to translate them after if you don't have a sizable population. But again, thinking about all of these issues is highly recommended. We also want you to think about making sure that there's accommodations such as more time available if some students need more than the class period, other types of things. And school personnel are really good about talking around, specific issues around all of these issues that we've talked about with language and accommodation. Again, I think we've talked about some of these, but we want you to think about whether or not your survey includes questions that will allow you to appropriately look at folks, gender identity, age, race, ethnicity, any other questions that are important in one community that we're working with right now. We moved away from kind of asking about a range of different issues related to LGBTQI and just asked if folks identify as part of the LGBTQI community, since the way in which they might define themselves varies considerably, but we determined that knowing whether or not they'd identified as part of that community was going to help us with what we needed to know in terms of addressing potentially some individual needs or concerns that might arise in that community. There are, of course, advantages of using standardized demographic questions. As Nina said, it's easier to compare yourselves to other communities, whether that's within Connecticut or nationally, but more and more, we're really needing to look at some of the ways that our standard questions are asked in some of the surveys that we've been using for a long time and make sure that they meet the needs of our local community. As I also mentioned, we want you to make sure that you're trying to get a representative sample of youth who can give you feedback on the survey content, specifically if you're asking about groups in underserved populations or higher risk populations. Again, we've had a lot of conversations in some of the coalitions that I've worked with about what does this question mean to you? That's one thing for adults to kind of bat back and forth, but it really makes sense to make sure that the kids themselves are interpreting it, because as we mentioned, and as Nina showed, you might have an introductory video that helps folks to understand what's going on, but each kid might ask their teacher, who might have their own interpretation. And so the questions, if there is any lack of clarity, could really skew your data. You want to think about the length of the survey. We're always balancing making sure that our surveys are as short as possible to facilitate that all the questions are answered, with also knowing that there are certain questions that we really need to know in order to be able to best serve the kids. We've also worked a lot on the order of questions, asking priority questions earlier on. That's one thing I would also say about using your own survey versus using a survey like Search. Search has an algorithm that they use so that if there's clearly been, kids filling things out in a way that doesn't make sense, that they were just joking around, which does happen once in a while, Search has ways in which they can throw them out, which might be easier than you doing that on your own if you're using your own survey. Are we missing any other equity considerations or anything else that folks want to bring up? Or have there been any questions up until this point, whether you put them in the chat or not, that you'd like to share or bring to the group? Okay. So,
Emily, this is
yeah.
Kath. I'll just share one thing, because this surprised me. So this is regarding the Fairfield Cares survey. We had our Board of Ed pass our survey last night. Yay. I was somewhat surprised. Well, let me back up. So we had some pushback on our initial gender questions and sexual orientation questions, and specific to the appropriateness of having these detailed options for middle school students. So we went back and, we heard the concerns. There were some other concerns. We heard the concerns, and we met with a small group of LGBTQ allies and modified those questions to the point where we basically eliminated the specificity of the gender options and limited to just male, female, non-binary, not listed, so option to write in or prefer not to answer, then and essentially eliminated the sexual orientation question altogether, and just replaced with do you identify as a member of the LGBTQ community? And which also meant that we eliminated the specific question asking if someone is transgender. And we did this, the feedback from the LGBTQ ally group was that by isolating transgender, it's kind of ignored the importance of all the others. And so we thought, okay, this was an equity issue that we wanted to take a look at. And so we just created that question that asked regarding all LGBTQ community members. the pushback, what surprised me was from the more liberal members of the board was they were concerned that by not asking more specific, they were concerned about not asking about transgender. Were we losing information there? Because we had asked about transgender in the past. And to my knowledge, we've never done anything specifically with that information. I actually think the data points were always so small that we really couldn't do anything. And that they also felt that while they supported the survey, they were concerned that by not being more specific about the sexual orientation, that we were also losing specificity. And that might be a disadvantage. So it was interesting. I just want to share that because it was not what I expected. I was expecting the conservative arguments. I was prepared for that one. So it. Anyway.
So as many of you know, it's been more and more of a challenge to get surveys approved in many communities across the state, that typically the questions that are challenged are around gender identity, sexual orientation, and suicide. And I think it's really got to be a compromise to some degree without losing the integrity that you need to do the work that we're given this money to do. And I think you've got to decide with your leadership team or your core group what your bottom line is. And so it sounds like, Kathy and Fairfield, you guys were able to come up with a solution to this problem. So you're still capturing information around sexual orientation, and you're still giving young people a choice to define themselves outside of just the binary male female. Typically, and Mark's going to get into this, so I don't want to spend too much time on it, but typically, to your point, those non-binary groups are small enough that we do have to group them and look at them that way. So that's not, in terms of data analysis, that's not typically going to be an issue, but we'll get into that more. So I think we're going to move on, but thank you for sharing.
Yeah, thank you. And so we're gonna just finish up with a poll, and then we'll move to Mark, who will talk. But this topic is certainly one that may be ripe for an additional workshop in the fall. There's a lot of different things, and there's a lot of different experience that folks have in the room for ways to be successful and making sure that you're getting, as Nina said, the survey that you need to, the questions that you need to ask at the same time, dealing with the current political climate that we're in successfully. So I think this is the last survey for real. And we want folks to talk about what they've done, or just answer what they've done in terms of getting approval from your administration. Do you have a formal documented process? Or do you have a process that changes, or that has changed maybe in the past year to year because of what's been happening around the state and around the country? Or do you use an informal process? Okay, so the 2/3 of you have a formal documented process. Some have a process that changes from year to year. Does anyone who has a process that changes from year to year, or who has an informal process, want to speak to that briefly? Okay. If we were in the room somewhere, I would be able to call on people, but I won't do that. So we're gonna talk. Mark is going to take over from here and talk some specifics about that issue, as well as getting into some of the more data specific questions and concerns.
Thank you. The issue of resistance by school boards as well as from members of the local community to survey content has become much more frequent in recent years. And much of this, I suspect, is due to the political polarization that has happened in our country. Community coalitions are reporting more pushback regarding survey questions, as has been mentioned, about gender identity, sexual orientation, as well as questions about suicide ideation and mental health issues. We have talked about perhaps presenting as a separate workshop a session just on dealing with these kinds of issues. I have conducted interviews with 2 coalition directors who have experienced resistance in getting surveys approved and have learned several helpful strategies for dealing with these issues. And I hope to do some more of these interviews. If you've experienced resistance to getting your survey or other program content approved, please reach out to me. I'd love to talk with you and learn what you found that worked and didn't work. At this point, I think you should all expect that at some point you will probably encounter some resistance to some of these issues, and that you should be strategizing in advance to how you would respond to them. And I'll just say that from the discussions I've had with 2 individuals, it's really critical that you have your allies, people in your coalition and others, and particularly students who can speak to the issue of why these questions are important. And that, I think, is going to be a critical thing in influencing school boards and other groups. Okay, next slide. Okay, protecting anonymity in data collection. One critical feature in getting reliable information on surveys, particularly surveys that ask the kinds of critical questions that our surveys do ask, is that participants know that their responses are anonymous. Now, to protect anonymity, there are several things we obviously can do. First, and most obviously, we can't ask students to put their names, student ID number, or any other personal identifying information on the survey. If you are using a paper and pencil survey, you need to have a secure method for collecting the completed surveys. For example, a large sealed box with a slit in it in which they can slide their surveys. I think the key thing is students should not be handing their survey directly to a person. They should be putting it in a place where no one can see what the content of their answers on the survey. If you're using a computer to collect data, which I think probably most of us are, my recommendation is do not use a school-based data collection system. Whether or not these systems allow for anonymous data collection, many students believe that their personal responses can be identified on school-based systems. So it's much better to use the school computers or their personal computers, if the school has issued them, to link them to an external survey platform such as SurveyMonkey. And as Nina had mentioned, on SurveyMonkey, there's settings where you can turn off the in part of it where it records IP numbers, so you can truly make it anonymous. A previous slide talked about getting student input on survey content. I think a good topic to ask students about is their beliefs about the anonymity of the survey process. Are there things that they have concerns about? If there are, what can you do to address these concerns? There may be some things you can do to get people to believe that the responses truly are anonymous. Okay, next slide. As much as we want to protect anonymity during data collection, we must also protect anonymity when presenting or reporting our findings. Under FERPA, the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, institutions releasing data from educational records are responsible for protecting personally identifiable information. Since schools typically have to approve our survey questions, and since surveys are conducted on school time, I assume the data we collect falls under the FERPA standards. Protecting personal identity can be complex when we're using information in table form where we are cross-tabulating data using other variables such as race, sex, grade, and so on. Some of the cells can get so small in number, students or faculty in that school can begin to identify, or at least have a pretty good guess as to who a person in that cell might be. Let's see, a 10th grade female African-American student who plays on an interscholastic sports team. If there are a small number of African-American students at the school, someone might be saying to themselves or to others, I bet that's Alicia. To protect, or at least to make these kinds of identifications more difficult, organizations such like the Connecticut State Department of Education have adopted guidelines regarding how we need to suppress, that is, not report data when the cell counts are small. Their guidelines I've listed on the slide, and I will show you an example to clarify this. I've also included a link to the State Department of Education's 4-page document on data suppression guidelines on the resource page. The rules are these. If any cell contains 5 or fewer individuals, that value is suppressed. It's not presented. If only one cell in a row or column has 5 or fewer members and is suppressed, the next highest value in that row or column is also suppressed. If there are multiple occurrences of this next higher value, you only have to suppress one of them. This is called complementary suppression, and is used to prevent people from figuring out the size of each cell by subtraction. If you list all the cell sizes except one, and then you list the total, it's very obviously you can go back and figure out the cell size. So by keeping 2 of them blank, it makes it more difficult to get an estimate of cell size. If we're talking about computed statistics such as means or percentages, we suppress the count, the statistic, if the count is based on 5 or fewer individuals. Or in the case of percentages, the numerator is less than 6, or the denominator is less than 20. The way to deal with small cell sizes is to reduce the number of crosstab variables to increase the cell size. Okay, let me give you an example of using small cell counts. Next slide. Consider this example. This is the XYZ high school, and Table A presents the demographics of this hypothetical high school. It's a small school. It has 500 students. The school is 90% white, 6% Asian American, and 4% African American. Table A shows the breakdown of race by grade. This table violates the FERPA guidelines because we have 2 cells that have counts of 5 or less, shown in red. So we need to revise the table using the guidelines for cell counts. Table B shows this revision. First, we have to suppress the 2 values in red and replace them with asterisks or other symbols indicating that we're not going to report the number. After that, we look at the columns that the suppressed values are in, which are the grade levels. And we need, if they are the only suppressed value in their column, we need to follow the second part of the rule, which says we must suppress the next highest value in these columns. This is the complementary suppression. So we have to suppress the values of 8 and 7, which are in green, so that it will be more difficult to determine actual cell size. Third, we look at the row counts, which are the races, and see if the changes we've made in the columns create a situation where there's only one suppressed value in the row. And in this case, there are none, so we don't have to do any more suppression. As I mentioned, these situations can be avoided if we reduce the number of variables in our table. So let's just go to the slide 25, the next slide. Okay. Here we've reported both race and students by grade, but we've done it in 2 separate tables. So table C just talks about the number of students in each grade without reference to race. And the table D talks about race of the students without reference to grade. Neither of these require any kind of suppression. to protect anonymity. Okay. Are there any questions regarding what I just talked about? Okay. Next slide. Okay, we're going to take a short break here for a few minutes, and
I
then
think we're
we'll
just
come
gonna
back.
literally let people stretch and we're gonna
Okay.
keep going because we're want to have time for questions and discussion at the end.
Are we
So-
running a little bit behind?
No, we're good. We're on right on time.
Okay.
But I do want to this is a good chance to ask any questions of anything we've covered up until now. We're going to switch gears just a little bit for the second part. Either unmute or you can drop a question in the chat, and you feel free to do that at any point moving forward.
This is Kathy. I'm going to ask a question with regard to sample size. So as long as I've been involved in the coalition, we've always done a sample of Fairfield students. It actually never occurred to me to try to get everybody. I was surprised to see that so many schools on the poll did that. In terms of a percentage of students, is there a particular percentage of students that you consider a healthy sample size per grade? Like if we're trying to survey a sample of 7th through 12th graders, I think this year we're hoping for like 400 from each grade, which is the most we would have ever surveyed. But and I don't know what the percentage of that is off the top of my head, but is there a particular percentage that's considered a minimum or an ideal amount if you're doing a sample?
I mean, Kathy, it just depends on, there is a healthy sample size, but it would depend on the percent, the number of kids in the overall population. And then there's ways to do that.
So it's really, you're looking not at the number, but your response rate. So I typically use 80% as a rule of thumb in terms of saying, if I have 80% of the kids from a school from 7th to 12th grade, for example, included in the analysis, I feel comfortable saying that they represent the entire population of that school. So that's what I use. There's no, some people might not, but for me, it's more about saying the results that you have in front of you that you're sharing out are a reflection of the entire population of students. I don't know, Mark, you might have another method.
I just would say that I think the most important issue is how you're choosing your sample. 400 per grade sounds like a pretty significantly large sample. I don't know the size of the schools, but I think the main thing is if you are doing it in a fashion that is somewhat random, that you're not choosing kids who are in honors classes or where the teacher agrees to let you come in. I think that's the key thing. So if you have to sample from classes, sampling from classes that are not based on academic ability would be really critical.
Thank you.
Okay, so this slide is just sort of a reminder to get us to think about how we're doing prevention. I think it's safe to say that any one single prevention program may not work equally well for all students. So next slide. Okay, so why is this important? I think it's important to collect and disaggregate our data by various subpopulations. And I think this comes down to our role as data analysts. Our job is to provide information that aids in identifying particular needs for prevention services. We know that people are different. They differ in a wide variety of dimensions: age, gender, race, income, culture, religion, and many more. These differences are likely to be related to differences in their particular risk and protective factors, as well as their receptivity to our intervention programs. When it comes to prevention, we know that one size certainly does not fit all. We need to ask questions that allow us to look at certain subpopulations, particularly those where there is research evidence of differences in the level of substance use and mental health outcomes. And the next group of slides explores some specific of the subpopulations. Okay, next slide. This lists a number of populations that we could consider. Some of you may have already looked at some of these groups in your own work and have found maybe some interesting and useful differences. I think it's important to think about the demographics of your community and any special characteristics or circumstances that may create populations at risk. Now, there's many more potential subpopulations that we can look at in a short period of time. And I'd like to talk about a few of them today. I'm going to share some research on 5 subpopulations that may have some particular relevance for you. So that's what I'm showing on the next slide. I'm going to talk briefly about 5 subpopulations: LGBTQ students, race, ethnicity, and biological sex differences and their impact on substance use and mental health, student athletes, students who work more than 20 hours a week during the school year, and students who've had more than one adverse childhood experience. For each group, I'm going to talk about some key findings from the research literature, identify some sources where you can find appropriate survey questions, and provide some references that discuss specific intervention strategies. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay. There is a large amount of research evidence that LGBTQ students have higher rates of substance use than heterosexual students, report higher rates of thinking about suicide, have higher rates of attempted suicide, have higher rates of depression and other mental health issues, and report that their school climates are less supportive than do straight students. The subscript numbers you see on the screen refer to references included at the end of the slides that will be sent to you in the near future. As we sort of noted, one of the biggest difficulties in collecting data on these subpopulations has been the proliferation of terms that individuals use to describe themselves. A recent study by the Trevor Institute, a nonprofit organization that runs a national telephone hotline and other supportive services for LGBTQ adolescents, identified over 40 different terms that adolescents use to classify themselves in terms of gender and sexual orientation. The Trevor Institute, along with SurveyMonkey and the Williams Institute, which is an organization connected with the UCLA Law School, have researched the question of identifying this subpopulation and have developed several sets of survey questions to classify gender identity and sexual orientation. I strongly recommend you follow their lead. I have listed one set of questions created by the Trevor Institute in the appendix, and you can easily access websites from the other two to see the question spaces they use, which are quite similar. In terms of interventions, there are a number of environmental strategies that work with school systems to create climates more supportive of sexual minorities. And Nina will talk more about an intervention that was done in Norwalk shortly. Okay, next slide. Okay. To look at the broad categories of race, ethnicity, and biological sex, that is, sex assigned at birth, and the relationships with substance use, I went to the 2019 National Survey on Drug Use and Health, done by SAMHSA. They conduct an annual survey with a sample of over 67,000 US residents ages 12 and up. And in 2019, when this survey, there were over 16,800 students in the 12 to 17-year-old category, which I'll be talking about. These intensive surveys ask questions about substance use and mental health, as well as detailed questions regarding racial and ethnic identification. They ask about a large number of substances, and today I'm only going to talk about 4 drug categories: alcohol, cigarettes, marijuana, and opioids. Unfortunately, their survey does not ask about vaping. And 1 category of mental health problems, major depressive episodes. For these substances, I only looked at 30-day use. Questions about depressive episodes asked about episodes occurring during the last year, not the past 30 days. So with these caveats in mind, I've listed 6 observations I made from looking at the data from the 12 to 17-year-old group. Females have higher prevalence of alcohol use and major depressive episodes than males. Hispanics have higher rates of use of alcohol, marijuana, and opioids than non-Hispanics. 3, African Americans have a lower prevalence of use of alcohol and cigarettes and similar rates of use of marijuana and opioids as whites. American Indians and Native Alaskans have higher rates of marijuana use than other races. Asian Americans have lower rates of substance use than other races, but their rate of depression is equivalent to whites. And finally, individuals who identify with 2 or more races have higher rates of marijuana, opioid use, and depression than those who identify with a single race. The questions that the survey used were questions taken from the U.S. Census in regard to ethnicity, race, and biological sex, and they are reproduced in the appendix of this presentation. In terms of intervention programs designed for racial, ethnic, and gender groups, there are a number that exist. I have listed them and have given references to them in the reference section. So there have been a number of programs that have been developed that target specific subpopulations. Okay, let me stop. Are there any questions people would want to raise at this point?
I don't see anything in the chat, Mark.
Okay. Okay, let's go on to the next slide then. Student athletes. High school sports participation is a particularly interesting subpopulation because the research evidence in this area is mixed. Sports team participation seems to be both a risk and a protective factor. On the one hand, studies show that students who participate in organized sports have higher rates of alcohol use, particularly binge drinking. On the other hand, sports participation seems to be a protective factor for non-cannabis related drugs. That is, student athletes tend to use less non-cannabis related drugs than do students who do not play on organized sports teams. The research on marijuana use is particularly mixed, with half the students showing higher use by athletes and half showing lower use rates versus non-athletes. In terms of asking questions about sports participation, one of the references I've listed, Kwan, gives some detailed questions about how sports participation was assessed in each of the studies that they reviewed. I have also included in the appendix some specific questions I have used in my surveys to assess sports team participation. In regard to interventions, the information is somewhat limited. Much of the research that I could find was geared towards elite athletes and preventing use of performance-enhancing drugs such as steroids. I should mention that locally, the Old Lyme Prevention Coalition has started a prevention program entitled Protect Your Game, which focuses on student athletes. About 80% of the student body at their middle and high school levels are involved with sports teams in the school. At the start of the school year, 21 coaches from these schools received training from the coalition on how to speak to their team about the impacts of substance use, And I've included a link to their information in the appendix. It is interesting to note that the coalition started this program not because they had particular data on higher substance use by sports team participants, but because so many of their students were involved with teams and it seemed a good theme to organize an intervention around. So they would be a good group to talk to about what they're doing and how they're doing it. My personal experience with school athletics and drug use is that there is considerable variation between coaches regarding how much they talk about substance use with their teams and the degree to which they enforce existing school policies regarding use. I would suggest that the high school athletic director would be a key individual to have as part of your coalition. Questions? Okay, let's move on to the next. Okay, students who work more than 20 hours a week. Another subpopulation that appears to be at risk are students who work 20 or more hours a week during the school year. I'm not talking about summer work. There is research data indicating that students who work 20 or more hours per week are more likely to use substances and have lower grade point averages than students who work fewer hours. The negative effects of excessive work appear to vary by race, ethnicity, and social class. White and Asian American students with the most highly educated parents show the greatest negative effects of high-intensity work on grade point average and substance use. Lesser negative effects have been found with Hispanic and African American students. One hypothesis of why this might be the case is that white and Asian American students who want to work a lot of hours are those who are already disengaged from school. In addition, working a lot of hours may give students the financial resources to purchase substances, and it introduces them into social circles of fellow employees, many of whom may be several years older than them. These older peers may increase high school students' access to substances, and they may also exert more peer pressure on them regarding substance use than younger peers. In certain ways, there is a certain similarity to the situation with student athletes. The research suggests that there are some positive factors that accrue for students who work few hours per week during the school year. For example, they seem to have better time management skills. But at greater numbers of hours, work is associated with more negative consequences. As in the case of student athletes, there is little literature regarding interventions for this population. After school work is under limited purview by schools. A student who wants to work needs to present certain documents, proof of age, Social Security, to get working papers from their high school. From what I can determine, there is no permission needed beyond having these documents from the school or the parents or guardians regarding work. I have included questions asking about work hours during the school year in the appendix. If you explore the subpopulation and find higher rates of substance use among students with higher numbers of hours, this might be something, a good issue for discussion with parents and perhaps administrative members of the schools. Okay. Any questions or comments on this? Okay, last one. Adverse childhood experiences. Adverse childhood experiences, or oftentimes referred to as ACEs, are defined as physical, sexual, and emotional abuse, neglect, being the witness of domestic violence, and other serious household dysfunctions, such as having a parent or caregiver who was a substance user, depressed or suicidal, or who was incarcerated. There has been a lot of research on the negative effects of ACEs on subsequent adult functioning, and more recently, research has demonstrated their ill effects during adolescence. For example, Meeker et al. Found in a community survey that students who had experienced 2 or more ACEs had significantly increased odds of suicidal ideation, suicide attempts, and substance use. odds of alcohol use were lower for Blacks, Asian, and Latinx students. Female sex was associated with higher risks of cognitive difficulties, depression, suicidal ideation, and attempts. In terms of measurement, there have been a number of scales developed to examine adverse childhood experiences, and I've included one of these in the appendix. Intervention work has focused on trauma-related care, and there are several articles regarding this in school settings that I have referenced. In particular, the review article by Roseby and Gascoigne identifies 8 different strategies used for trauma-informed care in educational settings. Okay. Next slide, that will be, someone else will be.
Yeah,
Nina, I think.
yes. So, I think Mark just gave us a lot of good reasons why it's important to unpack the data that we collect. By looking at these subpopulations and looking at your data, you're going to determine if there are any disparities among groups. And without asking a lot of these demographic and, club participation, sports participation types of questions, you're not going to be able to do that type of analysis. And if you have uncovered disparities among groups, it's going to allow you to implement the appropriate strategies, implement appropriate activities or programming based on what you found. So I will give you an example. 2 years ago in Norwalk, we conducted a student survey and we looked at our data and we realized that the group, the LGBT group, were showing much higher rates of risky behaviors and much poorer mental health. And so we worked together. There was a small group and we determined what, as a coalition, we could do in that community to support this population. We reached out to the Triangle Center. So they are a group based in Norwalk, but they really work within Fairfield County and across the state. They're an advocacy group for LGBTQ+. They provide programming. They provide a lot of resources in the community. If you're not familiar with them, they are a wonderful organization, and we do have their information in the slide deck. But basically, we brought them into the schools to provide, they call it LGBTQ 101. And it's a training that they were able to do in the first year with all of the middle school and high school staff and teachers in the public schools in Norwalk. And now we are in year 2, and they are actually working with the elementary school staff and teachers, and they are at the early childhood center. And what I can say is that the person doing most of this training has given us feedback that it's incredibly well received, incredibly appreciated, really helping clarify and give them knowledge they need to support the youth in their schools that are part of this subpopulation, this LGBTQ group. So that's a real concrete example of sort of why unpacking the data can be so valuable. I know it's been really quiet and nobody's had any questions or comments, but I would love to know if there's anybody here today that could share another example of how you were able to do that by looking at your data, whether it was small or big or anything. Either just mention it in the chat or unmute right now.
One case that I could suggest was we've looked at student athletes and did find evidence of athletes using more alcohol. And one of the things that we realized is that it was hard to intervene without the support of the school athletic director. And that's why I mentioned that that's an important person. If you want to do something with student athletes, you really need to have certain key individuals on your team to be able to do that.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Another topic that we're interested in potentially doing more of next year, a training, is really how you kind of take this to the next step. Do you have the right people to help you do that? Are the subpopulations that you've identified also represented in the group that are planning or programming or developing? You know, that's really important to get those voices. That's why reaching out to Triangle Center was so critical, because they were the experts. They also represented that population, and it was a perfect collaboration to have. Or if the right folks aren't at the table, you know, how do you get them there? And that's a lot of the capacity building work that communities and coalitions need to constantly be doing. And it's very challenging. There are a lot of resources around some of the tools and tips you can do for that. I know CADCA, if you're not familiar with CADCA, we've also listed that in our resources page. They do a lot of work around that. T-Task, I'm sure, is a valuable resource for that. So definitely make sure, and if you're not sure, it's a conversation worth having with your leadership team, and bringing it back to the people who are part of your group.
I'll just share, since I'm doing all the talking.
Yes, so Kathy, yes, Kathy, thank you.
And Jen, just plug your ears because you heard all this last night. But the silver lining of the whole sort of controversy around the gender and sexual orientation questions of the survey really was the fact that for really the first time in the 2 years that I've been staff for the coalition, that I've had direct interaction with members of the LGBTQ population in our community. And, you know, we brought in, or we attempted to bring in the Triangle Center to do some cultural humility training for the coalition. But we couldn't give them 90 minutes of our coalition meeting or do a separate training. It just didn't work out. So we did have a local counselor provide that. But because I was now getting input from LGBTQ members and allies, it's opened up a whole avenue for me now to continue to collaborate and widen that collection of folks who could really help shape the planning for the coalition in terms of our outreach efforts to the LGBTQ population. So that's all been a very good thing.
Yeah.
The other thing I wanted to mention was when Mark had put up the data from the National Health Survey. That was really great to see, because I did segment our student population, our 2021 student data by different ethnicities, and the data was small, the data points were small, but they actually, if my memory served me, kind of were in sync with what the national data was showing on those ethnicities. And the other population that we looked at too was our, and we were able to do this with this survey, is those students on an IEP, individual education plan, and taking a look at their substance use compared to non-IEP students. And that too was very helpful. We will not be able to do that in our current survey, but it was helpful to be able to segment at that different subpopulation level.
Yes, that's a great example. IEP, I work in a community that has a large Hispanic population, and we ask about English as a second language or English language learners. And so we're able to look at the data that way as well and determine the needs with that subpopulation. So, you bring up a good point, Kathy. The slides that Mark did, he did an amazing job of calling down a lot of information into a really great resource for folks as you move forward and you're asked challenging questions about why you need to know this or why you need to ask this. you now have a set of resources that you can use to show why it could be important and some of the national data to support it. I'm going to show you in a minute how Mark has set up the references, because a lot of that we didn't want to put in the slides. But again, we want you to keep this information and be able to access it when you are in a position where you might need to get some support and some documentation of why we're asking and why it's important. Disparity impact statement. This is sort of standing alone. We really think this would need to be a separate training. We just wanted to introduce it. Some of you are probably very familiar with this. Some of you may not be familiar with it. If you have a grant through SAMHSA, you typically do have to write a disparity income statement and report on it while you're reporting on your other funded information. But basically, what you're doing is an assessment and you're looking at disparities within populations. And then you are going to develop a plan to identify how you're going to reduce and eliminate those disparities. So it's a great exercise to do. It can seem a little overwhelming. I just recently did the disparities impact statement for a community the way SAMHSA requires you to do it. And I think there's a lot there that we could unpack. So that is something that we are going to offer you guys as a second, another training in early 2023. So I think we are at the end of the slides. So we're going to come back to this question slide. So I want to just quickly show you, there's a resource page that we've referenced several times. So make sure you know that you're aware that this is here. We always try to include acronyms because we know acronyms are annoying and we like to make sure we explain what we're saying. And then the references. So the way this is set up is each of the 5 subpopulations, you have subscripts 1 through whatever. And so they're going to match up with these pages. So the first one, if you remember that Mark did, was the LGBTQ. And so now you've got 1 through 17. So have fun. But that's how these are all set up. And again, this is a document that you will be sent and you can keep it and you can refer to it. And then there's actually a couple of appendices. Mark included the ACEs screener, the adverse childhood experiences screener at the end. So I just wanted to show that to you before you guys jump off. And before you go, I believe we have a survey. And in this survey, other than feedback, we've also given you about 5 options for future workshops that Mark and Emily and I would be doing, but we wanted to get a sense of where you guys were at in terms of what would be most useful and beneficial to you. So we've mentioned a couple of them: disparity impact statements, strategies around survey approval and buy-in, effective methods of data presentation and dissemination, and then I'm not sure, I think it's on there. But anyway, if you guys don't mind taking a minute to fill that out.
Nina, do you have an ability to copy paste the link into the chat from your slide?
Don't know. Let me try.
Just so people could click on it right now if they had a second to do it.
No, that didn't work.
Okay.
Where would we get, sorry, and where would we get ACEs data?
That information is in the appendix, and you can get information about sort of national averages, I believe, in some of the references. Let me just quickly say, if any of you have difficulty, I recognize that some of the journals that are cited are not things you'd find in your local library. If anybody is having difficulty finding them, I can access almost all of them if you just send me an email, and I can probably send you within a day or two a copy of the article. So if you need that access, please contact me.
Emily, can you find the SurveyMonkey link and drop it in the chat? Are you able to pull it up from your emails? It's not. I can try again.
You guys can, I'll look for it to you guys.
Okay, so now that we can see you all or see your little tile, just want to make sure there's no other questions or comments or anything folks want to share about anything we've talked about. I know we covered a lot, and hopefully it was, hi, Terry. Hopefully it was helpful. And I think we actually ended on time, which was our big concern. So that's exciting.
And I just dropped the link in the chat.
Oh, thanks, Emily. So we did such a great job. There's no questions.
All right, I'm just gonna keep going, so.
I'm
you know.
gonna
Sure.
stop recording now just for.
So locally, truly, where do we
So-
get ACES data for our student population?
So there are groups, Nina, what's the name of that woman who in Fairfield has been working around a lot of ACEs issues? Do you remember her name?
Allison,
She's at United Way, I think.
United Way has they're probably your best resource. They're actually working on an ACEs initiative in this area. There is not a lot of data around that, but we could certainly connect you with them. If there is data, they're the ones who have it. So we can get you their information.
Right. I mean, the other place that you would potentially get it is some pediatricians are asking.
It's
in their practice.
Bridgeport Prospers is the name of that organization. Yes. Sorry, Emily.
No, it's typically a screen that if it's being done in pediatricians' offices. So that's another place potentially to find out if there are local pediatricians that are implementing it.
Melissa?
Just a comment, I know some of us have been a little frustrated by the changes in the demographic data that we're collecting from like the LPCs, like they're collapsing ethnicity back into race. And I just wondered if you had any kind of thoughts on that.
So are they following the federal? Is it now aligning with the federal?
I don't remember who it's aligning with, but it used to be ethnicity was a separate question from race. And now they're kind of throwing them all back into the same kind of pot. So I'm concerned. I think there's some concern. Obviously it's not a survey question per se, but more of a kind of tracking the populations we're reaching.
Right.
And those of us have concerned about, for example, people who may identify as Hispanic and Black, say you have Dominicans, where do you put them? Because you kind of have to pick one or the other. And even multi-race doesn't really capture that. So I think a lot of us, at least in Region 1, there's a lot of discussion about that when they were rolling out the new demographic capture methods.
I think that if you are not distinguishing race and ethnicity as two separate things, you are, as you said, you're losing some of the unique individual representation. So you're just going to lose that. And people typically are not one or the other, right? So.
Right. Yeah, that was kind of just an observation from.
Yeah, no, that's a great point.
I have a quick question. Just from the surveys that you said have been like translated into other languages, is that something, so like, let's say you're using search, do they have that capability or do you have to consult with someone else to do that?
So some of Search's surveys are available in Spanish, some of them are not. I will say I did work with Search once and we were able to provide our own translations for Portuguese. And they took our translations and they set it up for us. So we did the translations and then they allowed us, the kids could basically toggle, they could pick English, Spanish, or Portuguese. The only other survey I know that's available in Spanish, I know Youth Voices Count is available in Spanish right now. I do not think Pride is available. CERAC, which is SERAC, which has another youth survey that folks in the state use. I do not believe that is available in Spanish. So you are limited a little bit.
Somebody in the chat earlier on said that they had translated theirs into Haitian Creole.
Emily Rosenthal said CERAC is available in Spanish. Thanks, Emily. Yes. Yeah, so it's definitely worth approaching them and asking if you can do your own translation and have them set that up for you, or if they would be willing to do it. but sometimes.
And also
it's
useful advocating for it. We were pretty surprised when Search came out with a new instrument that they wanted folks to use, and they weren't doing it in Spanish. So, I think there needs to also be pushback from the community that, we won't be using surveys that aren't available in a wide range of languages if it doesn't, if our community members need it.
Yeah, I wasn't, and I was just thinking, even in, I guess specifically in my role in problem gambling services, I know we have a few different surveys and I think they're only offered in English, but of course we ask, different race and ethnicity, and I think it would be good to offer it in other languages if it's a statewide survey too. So that's just good to know.
Yeah, absolutely. So we are at time, 2 minutes over. Thank you all so much. We really appreciate you being here with us, and we will have the slides out to everybody in the near future.
Thank you so much to Mark and Nina and Emily for today. Sounds like we have, hopefully it was a lot of information as people are working on their surveys, and plenty of topics that you're considering continuing the education in this area. So I hope everyone will fill out the survey so you can get some good ideas of what people are really looking to have further training on. So enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much for your time, and be well, everyone. We'll see you next time. Thank you.
See everyone. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.